The sky over Sicily burned white-hot on the morning of July 2nd, 1943. At 16,000 feet, the Mediterranean sun turned cockpit glass into a furnace, and the men inside their P-40 Warhawks felt sweat pooling beneath their flight suits as they escorted a formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers toward their target, the enemy airfield at Castelvetrano in southwestern Sicily. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall scanned the horizon through his gun sight, his eyes moving in the pattern drilled into him at Tuskegee. Sky above, horizon level, instruments repeat. This was his 8th combat mission. 8 times he had flown into hostile airspace. 8 times he had returned without firing a single shot at an enemy aircraft. In the cockpit of a P-40 Warhawk, a fighter that senior officers openly called obsolete, a machine that could not match the German fighters in speed or climb, Hall was exactly where the United States Army Air Forces believed he belonged, far from any real fighting, assigned to a unit that the brass expected would never accomplish anything worth remembering. Because Lieutenant Charles B. Hall was a black man in a white man's war, and to the generals in Washington, to the colonels who wrote damning reports, to the politicians who commissioned scientific studies, proving that African Americans lacked the intelligence and reflexes for aerial combat, Hall and every man in his squadron were nothing more than an experiment, a politically motivated experiment that the military establishment fully expected to fail. What happened in the next few minutes would begin to prove them all catastrophically wrong. The B-25 bombers below had just released their payloads, explosions blooming across the Axis airfield in clouds of smoke and dust, when Hall caught movement in his peripheral vision. 2 shapes, diving fast, the distinctive outline of gray-green paint, and wide radial cowlings that every Allied pilot had learned to fear. Focke-Wulf 190s. Hitler's finest fighters, the aircraft that had been slaughtering RAF Spitfires over the English Channel, the machine that German pilots called the Verger, the butcher bird, the most lethal aircraft in the Luftwaffe's arsenal, were screaming toward the vulnerable bombers, and Lieutenant Charles Hall, the pilot who wasn't supposed to be able to fly, who wasn't supposed to be able to fight, who wasn't supposed to be here at all, pushed his throttle forward and turned directly into their path. He would have known he was outmatched on paper. The FW-190 was faster over 400 miles per hour in level flight compared to his P-40's 360. It could climb harder, dive steeper, and carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns that could tear an aircraft apart in a single burst. The P-40 was a generation behind, a fighter designed before the war that the Army kept building because they needed something, anything, to put pilots in seats until the newer designs came online. But Hall also would have known something the Germans did not. He had been training for this moment his entire life. Every insult, every closed door, every person who had told him what he couldn't do, it had all been preparation for this. Charles Blakesley Hall was born on August 25, 1920, in a small clapboard house at 742 North Columbia Street in Brazil, Indiana, a coal mining town in Clay County that had seen better days. The brick kiln still burned, the mine still produced, but the optimism of the previous century had given way to the grinding reality of the 1920s. His father, Franklin Hall, worked as a kiln burner, tending the massive brick ovens that fed the town's pottery and brick industry. It was back-breaking work, 12-hour shifts in brutal heat, loading and unloading tons of clay product, breathing air thick with dust and ash. Franklin had come up from Mississippi seeking a better life, and Brazil was what he had found. His mother, Anna Blakesley Hall, had made the same journey north. Like so many black families of her generation, she understood that Mississippi offered nothing but sharecropping, Jim Crow violence, and a future circumscribed by the color of one's skin. Indiana was not paradise. It had been a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, but it offered possibilities that the Deep South did not. The Halls were not wealthy, they were not connected. They had no family money, no political patrons, no path to power. But they believed in something that had sustained black Americans through centuries of oppression. the transformative power of education and excellence. Young Charles, whom his friends would later call Buster, took to this belief completely. At Brazil High School, he excelled at everything he touched: academics, football, track and field. He was the kind of student who made teachers pause and reconsider their assumptions, who made coaches take notice despite whatever prejudices they might harbor. When Hall graduated in 1938, he enrolled at Eastern Illinois University, then called Illinois State Teachers College. He was going to be an educator. He was going to return to his community and lift the next generation, just as his parents had lifted him. But Charles Hall had a secret dream that burned in his chest every time he looked skyward and saw an aircraft tracing white contrails across the Indiana sky. He wanted to fly. In 1938, for a black man in America, this was not merely unlikely. It was, by official government policy, completely impossible. The United States Army Air Corps, the predecessor to what would become the Air Force, had never trained a black pilot, had never commissioned a black officer to fly military aircraft, had never so much as acknowledged that a black man might possess the fundamental capabilities required to operate a flying machine in combat. And according to extensive studies commissioned by the War Department, they never would. These studies, conducted by the Army War College between 1924 and 1939, concluded with all the scientific confidence of their era that black Americans were fundamentally, biologically, psychologically unsuitable for complex tasks like flying aircraft. The reports stated in official government language that African Americans lacked the intelligence required to master the technical aspects of aviation. They lacked the psychological stability required for combat situations. They lacked the reflexes and motor coordination necessary to operate sophisticated machinery. They lacked the leadership qualities that would allow them to command men in battle. One 1925 study concluded that the Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. Another stated that black soldiers were suited only for labor and service roles, never for technical specialties. The military didn't merely doubt black pilots could succeed. They had constructed an elaborate scientific and bureaucratic justification for why black pilots should never be allowed to try. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Corps, articulated the position bluntly. "Negro pilots cannot be used in our present Air Corps units," he stated, since this would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men, creating an impossible social situation. The objection was not about capability. It was about the entire structure of American society, a society built on white supremacy that could not imagine a black man commanding anything. But history has a way of forcing doors open. By 1940, war was consuming Europe and threatening to swallow the world. Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks. The German Blitzkrieg had swept through the Low Countries and France with terrifying speed. The British had been driven off the continent at Dunkirk, barely escaping with their army intact but losing everything else. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced an uncomfortable reality. The United States was almost certainly going to enter this war, and when it did, it would need pilots. Not hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. The mathematics of air power required a constant stream of trained aviators to replace the inevitable losses of combat. And Roosevelt also needed something else: votes. The 1940 presidential election was approaching, and Roosevelt was seeking an unprecedented third term. He needed every vote he could get, and black voters concentrated in the urban North, increasingly active in politics, and represented by an increasingly powerful press, were a constituency he could not afford to ignore. Civil rights organizations saw their opportunity. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Urban League, black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, and activists across the country began pressing the same demand. If black men were going to be drafted to die for their country, they should be allowed to fight for it too. The Pittsburgh Courier launched what it called the Double V campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The message resonated across black America. Why should black men serve in segregated units? perform menial labor, and be denied the honor of combat, while being expected to sacrifice their lives for a country that denied them basic civil rights. In January 1941, under mounting pressure from all sides, the War Department announced that it would begin training African American pilots in the Army Air Corps. There were, of course, catches. There were always catches when white America conceded anything to black citizens. The black pilots would train separately. They would serve in completely segregated units. They would never fly alongside white pilots, never command white servicemen, never be integrated into the normal structure of the military. They would be stationed at a base specifically constructed to keep them isolated from white servicemen, minimizing any contact that might disturb the social situation that General Arnold had warned about. And the base where this training would take place was in Tuskegee, Alabama, the heart of the Jim Crow South. It was a deliberate choice. Tuskegee Institute, the historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington, had been successfully training black civilian pilots through the Civilian Pilot Training Program. The infrastructure existed, the personnel existed, and Alabama's racial laws would ensure that the black airmen remained in their proper place when they left the base. The program was officially called an experiment, but everyone involved understood what it really was, a controlled demonstration designed to prove what the War Department already believed. Black men could not fly, black men could not lead in combat. The experiment was supposed to fail. Charles Hall arrived at Tuskegee in 1941, one of hundreds of young black men who had answered the call despite knowing the deck was stacked against them. They came from every corner of black America, college students and high school graduates, laborers and professionals, ministers' sons and the children of sharecroppers. They came knowing the military wanted them to wash out. They came knowing that every mistake would be scrutinized, that every failure would be used as evidence of their entire race's unfitness. They came knowing that the racism they faced at home would follow them into uniform. They came anyway. The training at Tuskegee was brutal, not because flying was inherently more difficult for these men, it wasn't, but because the program was designed with failure in mind. The attrition rate was set deliberately high. The standards were more rigorous than those at white training bases. The margin for error was essentially zero. At white bases, cadets who struggled received additional instruction, second chances, the benefit of the doubt. At Tuskegee, there was no benefit of the doubt. One significant mistake and you were gone. One bad check ride, and your dream of flight was over. The facilities were primitive compared to white training bases. Equipment was older, often hand-me-downs from other programs. Basic supplies that white cadets took for granted had to be requisitioned repeatedly, sometimes arriving weeks late. And beyond the base boundaries lay the reality of Jim Crow, Alabama. A black cadet in uniform could still be arrested for entering the wrong door, drinking from the wrong fountain, or looking at a white person the wrong way. Local law enforcement made no exceptions for military status. The war made no difference to the ancient hatreds of the South. The first class of Tuskegee pilots numbered 13 cadets. Only 5 graduated. Among them was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., who was at that time one of only 2 black officers of any rank in the entire United States Army. The younger Davis had endured 4 years at the United States Military Academy at West Point in complete social isolation. For 4 years, no cadet had spoken to him voluntarily, eaten with him, roomed with him, or acknowledged his existence except when military protocol absolutely demanded it. It was called silencing, a form of ostracism designed to break a man's spirit. Davis had graduated in the top 15% of his class anyway. He would become the commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron. He would become the man who held the entire Tuskegee experiment together when forces within the military tried to tear it apart. Charles Hall graduated on July 3, 1942, exactly 1 year before he would make history over the skies of Sicily. He earned his silver wings and a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps. He was assigned to the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later Fighter Squadron, the first black flying unit in American military history. And then, like his fellow graduates, he waited. The squadron was declared ready for combat, but the Army didn't deploy them. Week after week passed, month after month. The war raged across North Africa, where American forces had landed in Operation Torch. It raged across the Pacific, where the tide was slowly turning after Midway. It raged over Europe, where the combined bomber offensive was beginning to bring the war to Germany itself. TIV white squadrons shipped out within weeks of qualifying for combat. The 99th sat at Tuskegee, training, waiting, wondering if they would ever be allowed to fight. The delay was absolutely deliberate. Senior officers in the Army Air Forces were still hoping the program would fail on its own. Every week, the 99th remained stateside was another week for something to go wrong, for morale to crack, for an accident to provide an excuse, for the political pressure to ease. It took the direct personal intervention of the President of the United States to finally get the 99th Fighter Squadron overseas. In April 1943, the men of the 99th boarded the USS Mariposa, a converted luxury liner pressed into military transport service. They crossed the Atlantic through waters infested with German U-boats, part of a convoy carrying nearly 4,000 troops. They arrived first in Casablanca, Morocco, then traveled by rail across North Africa to Tunisia. They were going to war. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. later reflected on that moment in his memoirs. He wrote that leaving American shores felt, paradoxically, like freedom. They were released, at least for the moment, from the evils of racial discrimination. Perhaps in combat overseas we would have more freedom and respect than we had experienced at home. It was a hope that would be quickly tested. The 99th Fighter Squadron arrived in North Africa in late April 1943 and was immediately attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, a white unit that had been in combat for months and had no interest in nursemaiding an inexperienced squadron, especially not a black one. The group commander was Colonel William W. Spike, Momyer, a man whose reception of Benjamin O. Davis set the tone for everything that followed. According to multiple accounts, Momyer did not return Davis's salute when they first met. He greeted the 99th's commander, not in a friendly manner, but quietly official. It was a snub that everyone present understood. Under normal circumstances, a new squadron attached to an experienced group would receive mentorship, guidance, and training from combat veteran pilots. The experienced men would share hard-won lessons about enemy tactics, about local conditions, about the thousand small details that could mean the difference between life and death in aerial combat. The 99th received almost none of this. Momyer assigned them missions, but provided minimal support. The black pilots would have to learn everything the hard way, by surviving. They got 1 week with Colonel Philip Cochran, a respected pilot who actually tried to help, before being thrown into the crucible of combat. Their first mission came on June 2, 1943, a dive-bombing attack on the Italian island of Pantelleria, as part of Operation Corkscrew. Pantelleria was a strategic position in the Mediterranean that had to be neutralized before the planned invasion of Sicily. The 99th performed its duty. The island's garrison of more than 11,000 Italian and German troops eventually surrendered after sustained air and naval bombardment. But the mission was ground attack, not air-to-air combat. The pilots had dropped bombs and strafed targets. They had not engaged enemy fighters in the kind of swirling dogfight that truly tested a fighter pilot's skills. Through June, the 99th flew mission after mission: escort duty, ground attack, armed reconnaissance, patrol. They lost aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and mechanical failure. They flew in conditions that would have challenged any squadron: heat, dust, primitive airfields. They performed about as well as any inexperienced squadron would perform in its first weeks of combat operations. But about as well was not what the critics were looking for. They were looking for failure. By the end of June, Colonel William Momyer had seen enough to write his report. In his estimation, the black pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron were failures. They had engaged enemy aircraft only rarely and had scored no confirmed victories. They had not distinguished themselves in the aggressive, kill-seeking style that the Army Air Forces considered the hallmark of a true fighter squadron. Momyer wrote his assessment in official military language, but the message was clear: these men were not fighter pilots. They lacked the instincts, the aggression, the mysterious quality that separated warriors from passengers. The report went up the chain of command to Major General Edwin House, commander of the 12th Air Support Command. House added his own damning assessment: the Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. House forwarded the combined report to Major General John K. Cannon, Deputy Commander of the Northwest African Tactical Air Force. The recommendation was devastating. The 99th Fighter Squadron had failed to demonstrate effectiveness in combat. The black pilots lacked the aggressiveness and combat instinct of white pilots. The squadron should be removed from the combat zone and reassigned to coastal patrol duties or relegated to rear areas where they could not embarrass the Army further. And the recommendation did not stop there. The report further recommended that no additional black fighter groups should be deployed overseas. The 3 additional squadrons training at Tuskegee, which would form the 332nd Fighter Group, should never leave the United States. The experiment should be wound down. The War Department's original assessment, that black men were unsuitable for combat aviation, had been proven correct. If this report was accepted, the Tuskegee Airmen would be finished. Every sacrifice, every indignity, every month of brutal training would be erased. The men who had fought so hard for the chance to fight would be sent home in disgrace. Their failure entered into the official record as proof that the skeptics had been right all along. And the black community, which had invested so much hope in these pilots, which had celebrated every step of their journey in newspapers and churches across the nation, would be told that their sons and brothers had failed. But the report was based on a fundamental lie. The 99th Fighter Squadron had been in combat for less than 30 days. It had flown the same types of missions as white squadrons, flying the same P-40 aircraft in the same theater of operations. It had encountered enemy fighters only sporadically, because the primary mission assigned to them was ground support, not air superiority. It had performed exactly like every other inexperienced unit thrown into combat without adequate preparation or mentorship. The only difference was the color of the pilot's skin. Maumier had not compared the 99th to other new squadrons with similar experience levels. He had not considered the complete lack of mentorship from his own group. He had not accounted for the shortage of replacement pilots that kept the 99th undermanned. He had not mentioned the hostility of their own command structure, a hostility that he himself had created. He had arrived at the conclusion he wanted to reach, and he had built a report to justify it. In September 1943, word of the report leaked to the press. Time magazine, one of the most influential publications in America, published an article that drew on Maumier's assessment. The article insinuated that the Tuskegee Airmen had failed, that they weren't up to the job, that the skeptics who had always doubted black capabilities had been vindicated. The reaction in black America was fury. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, the New York Amsterdam News, the Atlanta Daily World, every major black newspaper in the country ran stories defending the 99th. Editorial pages demanded justice. Civil rights leaders demanded a real investigation, not a hatchet job by racist officers. And Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had been ordered back to the United States in September to take command of the newly forming 332nd Fighter Group, demanded the chance to defend his men. Davis, the quiet man who had survived 4 years of silence at West Point, who had learned to channel his anger into cold, calculated excellence, walked into the Pentagon to fight for everything he and his men had built. He held a press conference. He spoke calmly, methodically, devastatingly. He explained the conditions under which the 99th had operated, the hostility, the lack of support, the impossible standards applied to his men that were never applied to white squadrons. He noted that his men had been given no credit for the hundreds of ground attack sorties they had flown successfully. He noted that they had been thrown into combat without the mentorship that every other new squadron received. He noted that they had been chronically undermanned and under-equipped. And he noted something that the Time article had conveniently omitted. No one could cite a single instance of 99th Fighter Squadron pilots breaking formation and fleeing from combat. In the few dogfights they had engaged in, his men had fought, even when outmatched, even when outnumbered. Then Davis testified before a War Department committee studying the use of black servicemen in the armed forces. It was the most important testimony of the war for black America. Davis did not shout. He did not plead for sympathy. He did not engage in the rhetoric of racial grievance that white officers would have expected and dismissed. Instead, he presented facts. He presented statistics. He presented the kind of cold, logical, irrefutable case that a West Point graduate could build when he put his mind to it. His men were not failures. They were Americans who had been set up to fail and had succeeded anyway. The committee listened, and then, remarkably, they acted. The advisory committee recommended, and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall agreed, that the 99th should not be pulled from combat. The 332nd Fighter Group should move overseas when it completed training. The 477th Bombardment Group, a black bomber unit still in formation, should continue to develop. Marshall ordered an independent evaluation of the 99th, comparing its performance fairly and objectively to other P-40 squadrons in the Mediterranean theater. Davis had bought his men one more chance, but the evaluation would take months to complete. The findings would not be released until March of the following year, and by then July 2, 1943 had already happened. By then Lieutenant Charles Hall had already changed everything. Let us return to that moment in the sky over Sicily. Hall saw the two FW-190s diving toward the formation of B-25 bombers that his flight was protecting. He had perhaps seconds to react. The bombers had just released their payloads over Castelfranco airfield and were beginning their turn for home. Vulnerable, slow, unaware of the danger plunging toward them from above. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a fearsome machine, and Hall knew it. Designed by Kurt Tank for the Focke-Wulf Company, it had entered service in 1941, and had immediately begun tearing apart everything the Royal Air Force could put in the sky. RAF pilots who had grown confident in their Spitfire Mach-Vos suddenly found themselves desperately outclassed. The FW-190 was faster, could climb harder, rolled more quickly, and packed devastating firepower. Its armament told the story: 4 20mm cannons, 2 in the wing roots and 2 further outboard, plus 2 13mm machine guns in the cowling. A short burst from that array could dismember a bomber or vaporize a fighter. The P-40 that Hall flew, a P-40L, a lightened variant of the Warhawk series, serial number 42-10895, was an older design. Powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine, it was respectably fast in level flight, but could not match the FW-190 in climb or dive. Its armament had been reduced to just 4 .50 caliber Browning machine guns to save weight, with only about 200 rounds per gun, perhaps 20 seconds of firing time before the ammunition was exhausted. On paper, Hall was bringing a knife to a gunfight, but the P-40 had one advantage that German pilots consistently underestimated. It could turn. The heavy, rugged Warhawk could sustain tight horizontal turns that would bleed energy from the faster, higher wing-loaded German fighters. In a turning fight, the P-40's weaknesses became less relevant, and its strengths, stability, rugged construction, and excellent low-speed handling, came to the fore. Experienced P-40 pilots knew the formula. Don't try to chase. Don't try to climb. If the Germans dive on you, turn into them. Get inside their circle, make them fight your fight, not theirs. Charles Hall had been trained by men who understood this formula, and in the endless hours of training at Tuskegee, he had internalized it. Now it was time to prove it worked. Hall pushed his Warhawk between the German fighters and the bombers they were hunting. He turned hard into the diving FW-190 the maneuver that gave P-40 pilots their only real chance against superior opponents. The Germans, likely surprised to encounter aggressive resistance from what they may have assumed would be easy pickings, likely even more surprised at how quickly this American pilot was gaining an angle on them, made a critical error. They tried to follow him into the turn. This was precisely what Hall wanted. In a sustained turning fight, the P-40's advantages manifested. Hall pulled his aircraft around, feeling the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat, watching the lead German fighter slide closer and closer to his gun sight as the turn tightened. The FW-190, trying to match him turn for turn, was bleeding energy, losing the speed that was its greatest asset. The second German aircraft filled Hall's gun sight. He pressed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered as its 4 Browning machine guns roared to life. Tracers every fifth round arced across the bright Mediterranean sky, bright lines of fire connecting Hall's aircraft to his target. The pattern walked across the space between them, and Hall saw his rounds tear into the FW-190. Pieces of the German aircraft spun away, metal fragments, cowling panels, perhaps parts of the control surfaces. The FW-190 shuddered, staggered in the air like a wounded animal, and then fell off on one wing. It went down. Hall watched it plunge toward the sea or the Sicilian coastline below. The pilot may have bailed out. Hall didn't see a parachute, but he was busy. The other FW-190 was still in the fight, but not for long. Seeing his wingman destroyed, the second German pilot apparently decided this fight was not worth dying for. He rolled out of the turn and dove away, seeking the speed that would let him disengage and escape. Hall let him go. His job was to protect the bombers, not to chase glory. Charles B. Hall had just become the first black American pilot in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft. He didn't know it yet. In the chaos of combat, in the adrenaline-flooded moments after a dogfight, there was no time for historical contemplation. Hall formed up with the other members of his flight, escorted the bombers back toward friendly territory, and landed at their base on the Tunisian coast. But his wingmen knew what they had seen. His squadron mates knew. Word spread across the flight line with the speed of wildfire. By the time Hall's Warhawk rolled to a stop on the dusty runway at Farjuna, the news had already reached every man in the 99th. In lieu of champagne, a luxury that did not exist in the North African desert, the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron presented Lieutenant Charles B. Hall with the last cold bottle of Coca-Cola on the base. He had earned it. The news rocketed through the military command structure with unusual speed. Within hours, Hall's victory was being reported up the chain of command. Within days it had reached the highest levels of the Allied war effort. And then something remarkable happened. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the man directing the entire war effort in North Africa and the upcoming invasion of Sicily and Italy, carrying perhaps the heaviest burden of responsibility of any person in the Allied cause, personally flew to the 99th's base to congratulate a lieutenant from Indiana. Think about that for a moment. Eisenhower was planning Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. He was coordinating American, British, and Free French forces. He was managing difficult personalities like George Patton and Bernard Montgomery. He was answering to Roosevelt and Churchill. He was dealing with a million details that would determine whether hundreds of thousands of men lived or died. And he took time from his schedule to shake hands with a single pilot whose only claim to fame was one aerial victory over one German fighter. Eisenhower knew exactly what Hall's victory meant. Not militarily. The destruction of one FW-190 would not change the course of the war, would not affect the balance of power in the Mediterranean, would not even significantly impact Luftwaffe's strength in the theater. But symbolically, that single kill was worth more than a dozen German aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen had been written off. They had been called cowards and incompetents. They had been declared failures by their own commanders. Reports were circulating that recommended disbanding the entire program, and one of them had just done exactly what everyone said was impossible. The black press exploded with the news. The Pittsburgh Courier ran massive headlines. 99th pilot downs Nazi plane. War correspondent Edgar T. Rousseau wrote a lead that captured the electric excitement of the moment. He caught the Focke-Wulf 190, Hitler's finest fighter plane, in his sights. He pressed the button, his machine gun roared, and another Negro flyer had made headline history. Cartoonist Sam Malai drew a compelling image of Hall in his flight gear, capturing the determination and skill that had carried him through that dogfight. For Black Americans fighting the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home, Hall's triumph was proof of everything they had been arguing. Their sons could fly. Their brothers could fight. Their men were just as brave, just as skilled, just as American as anyone who had ever worn the uniform. The victory did not settle the question. The critics still had their report. The War Department evaluation was still ongoing. The experiment was still on trial, but Lieutenant Charles Hall had provided something invaluable: hope and evidence. Hall's victory on July 2, 1943, was the only aerial victory scored by the 99th Fighter Squadron in all of 1943, 1 kill. In 7 months of combat operations. To the critics, this remained insufficient proof of the squadron's worth. Colonel Mamuir's damning report still hung over the unit like a death sentence. The War Department evaluation was still grinding through the military bureaucracy. The Tuskegee experiment was still very much on trial, and the verdict remained uncertain. The men of the 99th kept flying. They moved from Tunisia to Sicily in late July, following the Allied advance across the Mediterranean. They transitioned from Tunisia's heat to the equally brutal conditions of Sicilian summer. They flew ground attack missions, strafing runs, close air support, escort duty, every mission the Army assigned them. On the same day Hall scored his historic victory, the 99th lost its first pilots in combat. First Lieutenant Sherman H. White and Second Lieutenant James L. McCullen went missing in action. A reminder that war extracts its price regardless of headlines. For every triumph, there was tragedy. For every success, there was sacrifice. Through the fall of 1943, the squadron transitioned to the Italian mainland, following the Allied advance north from Sicily. They operated from primitive airstrips near Naples, as American and British forces ground their way up the boot of Italy against fierce German resistance. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was fighting a different kind of battle in the halls of Washington. His testimony before the War Department committee had bought time, but the evaluation was still ongoing. Every mission the 99th flew was being scrutinized against the performance of comparable white squadrons. Every encounter was being logged and analyzed. Every result was being measured. The stakes could not have been higher. If the evaluation concluded that the 99th had underperformed, the entire Tuskegee program would be discredited. The 332nd Fighter Group, which Davis now commanded, would never deploy overseas. The 477th Bombardment Group, still forming at bases in the United States, would be disbanded. Every black pilot who had earned his wings at Tuskegee would be reassigned to non-combat duties or discharged from the service. Everything hung on the question of whether black pilots could truly fight. The men of the 99th would answer that question in January 1944, in the desperate skies over a beachhead called Anzio. Operation Shingle was Winston Churchill's brainchild, a bold amphibious assault designed to break the stalemate that had frozen the Italian campaign for months. Allied forces had fought their way up from Sicily. The German defensive lines anchored on the Gustav Line, and the fortress monastery of Monte Cassino had stopped them cold. The plan was elegant in conception. Land a major force at Anzio, 30 miles south of Rome, and well behind the German lines. The landing force would push inland, cut German supply routes, and force the Wehrmacht to retreat or face encirclement. The stalemate would be broken, Rome would fall, and the Italian campaign would surge forward. On January 22, 1944, more than 37,000 Allied troops splashed ashore at Anzio and the nearby town of Nettuno. They achieved complete tactical surprise. The Germans had not expected a landing this far north, this deep behind their lines. But then the operation stalled. Instead of pushing inland immediately to exploit their surprise, the commanders hesitated. They consolidated. They waited for reinforcements. They established a careful defensive perimeter around the beachhead. The Germans did not wait. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, reacted with the speed and ferocity that made the Wehrmacht so dangerous. Within days, German reinforcements were pouring toward Anzio from every direction. Panzer divisions that had been resting were rushed forward. Infantry formations were pulled from other sectors. Artillery was massed in the hills, overlooking the beachhead. The hunters became the hunted. By the end of January, the Anzio beachhead had become a killing ground. Allied forces were trapped in a pocket pressed against the sea, unable to break out, unable to retreat, subjected to constant artillery bombardment and infantry probes. The Germans called the beachhead the largest self-supporting powder cage in the world, and the Luftwaffe came hunting. On January 23rd, German aircraft attacked Allied positions on the beachhead. Hospital ships in the harbor were bombed. Supply dumps were hit. Artillery positions were strafed. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, but the German planes kept coming. 4 Army Air Forces fighter groups and their squadrons were assigned the task of defending Anzio from the air. Among them was the 99th Fighter Squadron, now attached to the 79th Fighter Group, a white unit whose commander, unlike Mamir, had given the black pilots a fair chance to prove themselves. The 99th had grown more experienced over months of combat. The men had learned the lessons that only combat teaches. They had lost friends and buried comrades. They had survived missions that should have killed them. They were no longer the untested newcomers who had arrived in North Africa 8 months earlier. They were ready. On January 27, 1944, large formations of FW-190 fighter bombers appeared over the Anzio beachhead. The German aircraft came in waves, diving through anti-aircraft fire to release their bombs before climbing away. Their mission was to destroy the beachhead's capacity to sustain itself, knock out the ammunition dumps, sink the supply ships, kill the soldiers huddling in their foxholes. The 99th Fighter Squadron was flying patrol over the beachhead when the raid developed. They did not hesitate. The black pilots dove into the German formation with a ferocity that caught the Luftwaffe completely off guard. The swirling dogfight that followed was exactly the kind of aggressive close-range air combat that critics had claimed black pilots were incapable of executing. They executed it brilliantly. Over the course of that day's fighting, 10 members of the 99th scored aerial victories, 10 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Focke-Wulf 190s, the same aircraft type that Hall had downed over Sicily 7 months earlier, fell from the sky in flames and spirals of smoke. Second Lieutenant Clarence Allen shot down half an FW-190, sharing credit with another pilot. First Lieutenant Willie Ashley Jr. claimed a full victory. Second Lieutenant Charles Bailey scored. First Lieutenant Howard Baugh shot down 1.5 enemy aircraft. Captain Lemuel Custis, one of the original 5 graduates of the first Tuskegee class, claimed his first victory. First Lieutenant Robert Dees scored. Second Lieutenant Wilson Eagleson, First Lieutenant Leon Roberts, Second Lieutenant Lewis Smith, and First Lieutenant Edward Toppins all added kills to the squadron's total. All of the downed aircraft were FW-190s. All of them were Germany's finest. The Luftwaffe raid was shattered. The remaining German aircraft fled for their lives, diving away toward friendly territory. But the victory came at a cost. Lieutenant Samuel Bruce was killed in the engagement. He had bailed out when his aircraft was hit, but his parachute failed to open. Even in triumph, war demands its blood price. The day was not over. On January 28th, the Luftwaffe returned. Another wave of FW-190 struck at the vulnerable beachhead, trying to finish what the previous day's raid had started. And again, the 99th was waiting. This time, Captain Charles Hall, now promoted from the lieutenant who had scored that first historic kill over Sicily, was among the victors. Hall engaged the German formation and shot down 2 more FW-190s, bringing his personal total to 3 aerial victories. Second Lieutenant Robert Dees added another kill. Second Lieutenant Lewis Smith scored again. When the day's fighting ended, the 99th had claimed 3 more enemy aircraft destroyed, bringing their 2-day total to 13 confirmed victories, 13 enemy aircraft in 48 hours. 8 fighter squadrons had been defending Anzio during those 2 days. Together, all 8 squadrons combined had claimed 32 German aircraft destroyed. The 99th Fighter Squadron, the unit that Colonel Mamir had declared unfit for combat, the unit that racist officers wanted pulled from the war, the unit whose pilots were supposedly too unintelligent and too cowardly to engage in aerial combat, had scored the highest of any squadron. The vindication was complete. Word of the victory spread rapidly. General John K. Cannon,
The same officer who had received and endorsed Mamir's damning report 5 months earlier flew to the 99th's base to personally congratulate the men. His message was simple and direct: keep shooting.
General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, sent his own commendation. The results of the 99th during the past 2 weeks, particularly since the Nettuno landing, are very commendable. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., reading the news in the United States, where he was preparing the 332nd Fighter Group for deployment, understood exactly what had happened. In his memoirs he would later write, "We immediately received news of the 99th's aerial victories over the Anzio beachhead on 27 and the 28th of January, just days before our landing. This came as a tremendous shot in the arm. The glamour of a quick succession of aerial victories immediately produced a wave of recognition for the 99th and other black airmen in the theater. No number of bombs expertly placed on ground targets or in support of ground troops could have produced comparable acclaim. When the War Department study was finally released on March 30, 1944, it confirmed what Anzio had already demonstrated. The 99th Fighter Squadron had performed as well as any other P-40 unit in the Mediterranean theater. The critics were silenced. The experiment had succeeded. Charles Hall's war continued. He flew more missions, escorted more bombers, engaged more enemies. His Distinguished Flying Cross, the first awarded to a black pilot in American history, recognized his actions at Anzio, where he had proven beyond any doubt that he could dogfight with the best pilots Germany had. By late 1944, when Hall rotated back to the United States for a war bond tour, he had flown 198 combat missions. He had scored 4 confirmed aerial victories. He was among the elite of the Tuskegee Airmen, one of only 9 pilots from the entire 332nd Fighter Group to score 3 or more confirmed kills during the war. The 332nd itself had arrived in Italy in early 1944, and in May, the 99th was finally assigned to it, bringing together all 4 black fighter squadrons under one command: the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd, under Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Leadership: the 332nd transitioned from P-39 Airacobras to P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally to the aircraft. They would become most famous for the P-51 Mustang. And those Mustangs got a distinctive paint scheme: bright red tails. The red tails were born. Through the summer and fall of 1944, through the final months of the war in 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group wrote a combat record that would become legendary. They escorted heavy bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, to Berlin, to Munich, to the oil refineries and aircraft factories that fueled Hitler's war machine. On March 24, 1945, Colonel Davis led 43 P-51 Mustangs on the longest bomber escort mission in the history of the 15th Air Force, a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin itself. The target was a massive Daimler-Benz tank factory, heavily defended by everything the dying Luftwaffe could put in the air, including jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, faster than anything else in the sky, capable of slashing through bomber formations and escaping before piston-engine fighters could react. It was supposed to be Hitler's wonder weapon, the technology that would turn the tide of the air war. The Red Tails shot down 3 of them that day. 3 jets destroyed by black pilots flying piston-engine fighters, men who, 4 years earlier, had been officially deemed incapable of flying anything at all. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown more than 1,500 missions. They had destroyed over 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, with hundreds more destroyed on the ground. They had earned more than 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, over 60 Purple Hearts, and 3 Presidential Unit citations. 66 Tuskegee Airmen had died in combat. 32 had become prisoners of war. The myth that black Americans could not fly, could not fight, could not lead in combat, had been demolished by the weight of evidence. But the men who came home from Europe found that not everything had changed. Charles Hall left the Army Air Forces in 1946 with the rank of major. He was a decorated combat veteran, a pioneer, a hero. He had personally shot down 4 enemy aircraft. He had flown nearly 200 missions. He had been present at the creation of something that would reshape American military history. He was also a black man in an America that still enforced rigid segregation in half its states. An America that still denied black citizens the right to vote throughout the South. An America that still tolerated lynching and discrimination as facts of life. An America where the same government that had pinned medals on his chest still operated separate facilities for colored at every federal installation. Hall could not get a job with a commercial airline. No airline in America would hire a black pilot, regardless of their wartime record, regardless of their decorations, regardless of anything. The men who had protected American bombers over Berlin were not considered qualified to fly passengers from Chicago to Detroit. Before his military career ended entirely, Hall served on one final duty that illustrated both how far the Tuskegee Airmen had come and how far America still had to go. In April 1945, the 477th Bombardment Group, the black bomber unit that had been training stateside throughout the war, was stationed at Freeman Field, Indiana. The base commander enforced strict segregation, operating separate officers' clubs for white and black officers in direct violation of Army regulations. When over 100 black officers attempted to enter the whites-only club, they were arrested. It became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny, a direct act of civil disobedience by military officers demanding equal treatment. The officers faced courts-martial, and Charles Hall, the hero of July 2nd and Anzio, was appointed as one of 10 officers, all black, to serve as the court. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. presided. It was a complicated moment, black officers judging black officers for protesting segregation that was itself illegal. The men on trial were ultimately convicted of minor charges and given reprimands, but the mutiny had drawn attention to the fundamental contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. That contradiction would take years more to resolve. Hall eventually settled in Oklahoma City in 1948, a year after his military service ended. He worked first at a drugstore, a job that had nothing to do with the aviation career he had earned in combat. Later he found employment at Tinker Air Force Base, working in a civilian capacity for the service that had once called his abilities into question. He transferred to the Federal Aviation Administration, the agency responsible for regulating the civilian aviation industry that still would not employ black pilots in cockpits. He married. He raised children. He lived a quiet life far from the headlines that had celebrated his victory 15 years earlier. Those who knew Hall described him as humble, almost painfully so. He did not seek recognition. He did not trade on his fame. He did not tell war stories unless pressed. He simply lived as so many veterans did, carrying his experiences in the private silence of his own memory. On November 22, 1971, Charles Blakesley Hall died. He was 51 years old, far too young for a man who had survived so much, who had contributed so much, who had proven so much. But the story did not end with Hall's passing. In 1948, 3 years after the war, President Harry Truman had signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The Air Force, the new independent service created from the old Army Air Forces in 1947, became the first branch to fully implement integration. The Tuskegee Airmen had made that possible. Their success in combat had proven that every argument for segregation was a lie. Their performance against the Luftwaffe had demonstrated that excellence knew no color. Their courage, the courage of men like Charles Hall, who had pushed his throttle forward and flown directly into the gun sights of Hitler's finest fighters, had shamed a nation into acknowledging what it had always denied. If black pilots could fly and fight and win as well as white pilots, and the record proved they could, then there was no legitimate basis for segregation anywhere in the military. The entire structure of separate but equal collapsed under the weight of what the Red Tails had accomplished. Over the following decades, men who had served with the Tuskegee Airmen rose to the highest ranks of the military and beyond. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the first black general in the Air Force, and eventually earned 4 stars, the same rank his father had achieved in the Army. Daniel Shappy James Jr., who had trained at Tuskegee, became the first black four-star general in any branch of the United States Armed Forces. In 1949, just 4 years after the war, the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group entered the newly formed Air Force's inaugural Top Gun gunnery competition in Las Vegas, Nevada. They won. The men who had been told they couldn't fly, couldn't fight, couldn't compete with white pilots had just proven they were the best in the entire Air Force. Yet it would be decades before they received proper recognition for that victory. Another reminder that change came slowly, even after the doors had been forced open. As the 20th century continued, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen became ambassadors for a history that mainstream America had initially tried to forget. They spoke at schools and civic organizations. They participated in documentaries and historical projects. They shared their stories with generations who had never known a segregated military, helping them understand what had been overcome. In 1995, HBO produced a television film called The Tuskegee Airmen, introducing their story to millions of Americans who had never heard of the Red Tails. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the surviving Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the nation can bestow, reserved for those whose achievements have fundamentally impacted American history. In a ceremony at the Capitol Rotunda, nearly 300 surviving airmen and their families gathered to receive the recognition that had been 66 years coming. The Tuskegee Airmen helped win a war, President Bush said, and you helped change our nation for the better. Charles Hall was not there. He had been gone for 36 years, but his legacy was present in every hand that was shaken, every medal that was displayed, every tear that fell from aging eyes remembering long ago battles in distant skies. On June 18, 2002, the Tinker Heritage Air Park in Oklahoma City, the base where Hall had worked for decades, was renamed the Major Charles B. Hall Air Park in his honor. A replica of a P-40 Warhawk now stands there, painted in the colors Hall would have flown, pointing skyward as if still hunting German fighters over Sicily. In August 2009, Hall's hometown of Brazil, Indiana, the coal town where a kiln burner's son had dared to dream of flight, dedicated a monument to its native hero. The small town that had sent one of its own to change history finally acknowledged what he had accomplished. The inscription reads, in part, on July 2, 1943, Lieutenant Hall earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for shooting down a German Focke-Wulf 190 during a mission over North Africa. In doing so, he became the first African-American pilot to earn official credit for destroying an enemy airplane in the Second World War. In 2012, George Lucas produced Red Tails, a feature film about the Tuskegee Airmen, bringing their story to the largest audience yet. In 2022, Charles B. Hall was inducted into the Indiana Aviation Hall of Fame, taking his rightful place among the aviators who shaped history. The recognition keeps coming, but it is Hall's legacy that matters more than any award. There is a moment in every great story where the outcome hangs in the balance, where history could go one way or another, where the difference between what was and what might have been rests on a single decision, a single act, a single person who refuses to accept the limits others have imposed. On July 2, 1943, that person was Lieutenant Charles B. Hall. He was flying an obsolete aircraft against Hitler's finest fighter. He was a member of a squadron that powerful men wanted to see fail, whose very existence was considered an embarrassment to the Army Air Forces. He was carrying the hopes of millions of Americans who had been told, every day of their lives, that they were less than, less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of respect and opportunity. And when two FW-190s dove toward those bombers, Hall did not run. He did not freeze. He did not radio for help or break off and hope someone else would deal with the problem. He flew between the Germans and their prey. He turned inside them. He pressed his trigger. He shot one of them out of the sky. He proved that everything they had said about him, about his squadron, about his race, about what black Americans could and could not do, was a lie. That single kill over Sicily did not win the war. It did not end segregation. It did not solve the problems that still trouble America more than 8 decades later. But it opened a door, and through that door walked thousands of men and women, pilots and generals, astronauts and airline captains, engineers and educators, who built on what Charles Hall and the Tuskegee Airmen had proven with their courage and their blood. Excellence is the answer to prejudice. Courage is the answer to those who doubt you. The sky belongs to those with the skill and the will to claim it, no matter what the world says they cannot do. Charles Hall proved that in a P-40 Warhawk over Sicily, and we are still living with what he proved. Thank you for watching this story of the Tuskegee Airmen and Lieutenant Charles B. Hall. If this history moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories deserve to be remembered, not just as history but as reminders of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limits others try to impose. I'd love to know in the comments, where are you watching from? And do you have any connection to World War II history? A grandfather who served, a family story that deserves to be told. The generation that fought that war is almost gone now, and every story we preserve is a gift to the future. Let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep looking up.